Good evening, friends, and welcome to Pendle Hill. So nice to see everyone out for our first Monday lecture this December. We're glad to have you here. You may have noticed that I was trying to check folks in as they came in. If I didn't capture you, on paper, that is, I'd appreciate knowing who was here. So if you came in a little bit after I picked up the microphone, it would be helpful for me to know who's here. We're trying to keep more accurate attendance to let our board and the public know how many people are seeing us. So you know the people who are in the room, and we have people who are watching us by live stream in different parts of the country. So we're very happy to have that. Julian has been helping us so many years doing the live streaming that give him a nod of great appreciation. As many of you know, before I introduce people, I'd like to give my commercials at the beginning while I have a captive audience. Next month, our program is going to be Money, Debt, and Liberation, a talk by Pamela Haynes. Many of you may have read her Pendle Hill pamphlet or her book Toward Right Relationship regarding finance that she did for the Quaker Institute for the Future. She herself was raised by an economist, and although she is herself not one, I found the way that she wrote about the way debt enslaves us as a society and prevents our freedom resonates extremely well with friends who are committed to living simply and also are caught up in our general society in ways that we're trying to avoid. This being both on a personal level and, of course, as well on a country, nation by nation approach. I found it interesting that the claim of the administration recently is that China has been trying to enslave other nations by debt through these public transportation infrastructure things. Funny how they know that that's what they're doing since we did it so long. Anyway, I think you'll find her talk very interesting. That'll be on the first Monday of January, which I believe is the 7th because I don't have it right in front of me. There are flyers out there. We'd also like to encourage you, if you have not already registered and are interested in a long and extended conversation about peace in Israel-Palestine, what would justice look like in Palestine, Israel. There is a conference we're holding here, December 14th, 15th, and 16th. It's not too late to register. The array of people that have been assembled by American Friends Service Committee, Pendle Hill, and the Quaker Palestine Israel Network is a pretty amazing array of people who are well informed and have knowledge of what's going on in the ground. So I recommend that highly. Enough of the commercials. It is my pleasure to introduce to you, which I will do first. I'll introduce Lyn, and then we'll go into a period of silent worship, and Lyn will speak out of the silence. We have the flyer, which gives you the full background. I can say that I've known Lyn since I first came to Pendle Hill, and she was living here at the time. She came back from her experiences in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, back from the war-torn area that she had been living in and witnessing in, and started to write her book at the time she came back to Pendle Hill in the 90s. She's finished that book, and we're very glad to have her here to sign copies of her book, Treading Water at the Shark Café, a memoir of the Yugoslav Wars, which she'll be talking about tonight, as well as her personal experience in finding a leading, having it confirmed and supported by other Quakers. Part of her back, I would say right at the moment, you are probably principally a writer. Would that be accurate? Okay. She's done many things. She's taught English as a second language, which is what you were doing, I think, when I first came to Pendle Hill. Before she left for Yugoslavia, she was the director of planned giving at the American Friends Service Committee, and I had the joy of working with Lyn on the AFSC, I guess it's now called the Nobel Peace Prize nominating working group. It's no longer a committee, it's now a group. So well-versed in peacemaking, and coming at this, as the title of the program suggests, a Quaker woman's witness to war. So without further introduction, I would like to invite you to turn off your cell phones, your beepers, your pagers, other devices that make noise in the night, and settle into a period of silence, out of which Lyn will address us.
The first thing I have to do is make sure that you can hear me. Is this good? Good. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I'm always delighted to be back in this room. It holds special memories for me. I always think of Pendle Hill as a refuge. It's unadorned, simple, protected from the outside world, surrounded by nature. A refuge. But it is not restful. At least it wasn't for me. If any of you have lived or worked here or lived here as a student, you know that Pendle Hill is a beehive of activity. I remember a bell rings early in the morning and it's time for breakfast. And another bell rings at 8:30 or something and it's time for meeting for worship. And another bell rings and now it's time for class. And then the lunch bell rings, and then we are doing our jobs or our activities or meeting with our spiritual advisors. It goes on and on. Everyone has a job. Everyone has a concern. Everyone has some project that they want to finish and share with others. This, by the way, at Pendle Hill is where I first learned how to fold fitted bottom sheets. I arrived at Pendle, very useful, yes, indeed. I arrived at Pendle Hill in the fall of 1999, almost 20 years ago, having just returned from the wars in Yugoslavia, where I'd volunteered as a peace worker with the Balkan peace teams. We traveled back and forth between Belgrade, Serbia, and Pristina, Kosovo, meeting with bright young people on both sides of the ethnic conflict, who were using strategies of nonviolence to bring about social change. I was excited by their vision of the future, hopeful that the war in Kosovo could be averted. And then in the spring of 1999, NATO bombs started to fall on Belgrade and Pristina. Our team moved to Skopje, Macedonia, trying to reconnect that shattered web of peace activists and colleagues who had fled the destruction of the NATO bombs and the Serb military. We searched in refugee camps and on the streets of Skopje and Tetovo, hearing rumors and heartbreaking stories. I was exhausted when I got back to Pendle Hill in June of 1999. And I remember before I came that I had been sitting in an internet cafe in Macedonia, in Skopje, Macedonia, longing for a place of comfort, dreaming of a big white bed where I could lie down and sleep. And I wrote to someone at Pendle Hill asking if I could come and asking for a scholarship. But when I got here, I couldn't relax. And so I started writing. I wrote to quiet the voices in my head, to clear a path through the anger and confusion I felt about the war, about my country bombing my friends and colleagues. I wrote to ease my conscience, and words poured out of me like water gushing from a hose that's been tightly coiled all winter. But most of the words swirled around and landed in a puddle on the floor. I had lost my way, spiritually and emotionally. The word unhinged comes to mind. That's the title of my talk tonight. Liberated or unhinged. First, let's think about unhinged, because that's how I felt then. It conjures up several images, maybe a battered old door hanging by the hinges, or perhaps a loosening of social conventions, a dramatic break with the norm, a crazy notion. That's what friends and family thought about my decision to go to Serbia and Kosovo in the summer of 1999. Why would a responsible, middle-aged woman like myself quit her job, leave friends and family, and set off on a dangerous and some might say foolish undertaking? The war in Bosnia had ended by then, but a ground war in Kosovo was beginning to heat up. There were already threats of NATO bombing. My 30-something-year-old son, Timothy, said aloud what others were only thinking. Aren't you a little old for this kind of thing? Quit your job at your age? You're never going to get another one. Traveling to a war zone? You don't even speak the language. But I went. Liberated or unhinged? That's the question. But that's not how my story begins. It begins in the fall of 1993, 5 years earlier. I was in my 50s. My 3 children and their significant others, plus my 7-year-old granddaughter, made up my extended family. After some pretty tumultuous years, I'd landed safely in what I thought was my dream job, Director of Planned Giving at the American Friends Service Committee. I'd bought a house in the suburbs. I'd thought my life had finally settled down. But I was wrong. My life was about to take a new turn, a twist, a jolt that propelled me from my safe and comfortable life to the war zones of the former Yugoslavia. Now, I just want to take a little time out here because you probably want to get oriented. So first, let's look at this map. This is a map of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. It was started at the end of the Second World War. You may remember the name Marshal Tito, was a dictator of Yugoslavia. It was made up of these republics, Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, with 2 autonomous regions, Vojvodina and Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Macedonia. The thing that's important about these republics is that they were very much divided ethnically and religiously. So Slovenia and Croatia, which at one time had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were Roman Catholic. Serbia, which had been ruled by the Ottoman Empire for more than 500 years, was Serbian Orthodox, with a vast majority of Muslims living in Kosovo. Bosnia-Herzegovina was a mixture of Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Muslims, and Bosnian Croats, a lot of intermarriage. You may have remembered, some of you are old enough, the Olympics in 1987, I think it was, in Sarajevo, 84, and the country was touted as this religiously diverse, ethnically wonderful place. And then a few years later, 10 years after Tito died, the country started to break up. There are lots of reasons for that. I'm not going into that tonight. We can talk about it later if you want to. So first, in 1991, Slovenia declared its independence, followed quickly by Croatia, and then Macedonia. And the Serbian government was the capital of this whole country was in Belgrade, Serbia. The army was there. So the Yugoslav army invaded both Croatia and very mildly in Slovenia. I didn't pay much attention to this at the time. I was in my work, I was doing my job, and I'd heard that in the Balkans, this is where violence is always occurring. I really didn't pay much attention. And then Bosnia-Herzegovina declared its independence. And immediately war broke out between the Bosnian Serbs and the Bosnian Muslims. And that's when the war started to enter my consciousness. You probably remember the siege of Sarajevo. You remember Vedran Smilovic, the principal cellist of the Sarajevo Orchestra, playing his cello in the ruins of the National Library. I think that's an iconic photograph that we all know about. And then we would hear all these kinds of reports on our news about the war, particularly in Bosnia. But it wasn't until I heard and saw pictures of this beautiful old 500-year-old bridge in the southern part of Bosnia in Mostar that this war really opened my heart. And I just want to read to you a little bit about that first impression. On November 9th, 1993, I had just returned from a week-long fundraising trip to Florida. I was tired, and I dropped my bags and briefcase and pocketbook at the foot of the stairs, carried my pile of unopened mail into the living room, turned on the TV to catch the evening news. Stari Most, a lovely old stone bridge in an obscure village of Mostar, Bosnia, was in the news again. I could hear the pop, pop, pop of machine gun fire and the chatter of small explosions as the camera zoomed in. Lines of black tires hung on ropes on both sides of the bridge of that once perfect crescent of white stone, a futile effort to protect it from the onslaught. The bridge shuddered with each impact, and the tires swayed and bumped against each other in a macabre dance. Large chunks of stone dislodged and fell into the rushing green waters below. Suddenly, without warning, a mortar found the keystone, and the arch exploded in a cloud of shattered stone and billowing gray smoke. The hand-hewn stone bridge that had spanned the Neretva River, connecting the people of East and West Mostar for almost 500 years, was gone. I could hear the shouts of the onlookers, the triumph in their voices. I was horrified. Loss, disconnection, betrayal, war. It felt to me in that moment that all of civilization was crumbling. Painful memories and emotional wounds from my own past welled up. That beautiful ancient bridge seemed almost human to me. And the deliberate destruction of a cultural icon blown up by its own citizens was an act that horrified me. This wasn't an invading army. The people of Mostar knew each other, neighbors turning against neighbor. That was what struck me as the cruelest kind of betrayal. What would lead a person to betray a neighbor like that? I couldn't turn away. I needed answers to those questions. And one of the first things I did was to join an organization called the Community of Bosnia Foundation. And it was started by a professor at Haverford College, a religion professor. And it started as a kind of think tank to spread information about the Muslim religion. But by 1995, we were hearing talk of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. First, the siege of Sarajevo, then the massacre of 71 young people in the center of Tuzla, and then reports from Srebrenica that 5,000 to 10,000 men and boys were missing and supposedly killed by the Bosnian Serbs. There was talk of genocide, of another Holocaust. So we started bringing Bosnian Muslim teenagers out of harm's way to study in the Philadelphia area. I agreed to sponsor Edita, a 16-year-old girl from Tuzla, Bosnia. And let me just stop there and say, Edita wanted me to change her name in the book. So in the book, her name is Amira, but I can't remember that. So I just keep calling her Edita. Is that all right? So you'll hear that. So I agreed to sponsor her. Each student, before they came, had to have a sponsor who would be financially responsible, a host family, and a scholarship from one of the schools around here. Edita received a 3-year scholarship to Westtown School. And they also had awarded a scholarship to a Serb from Belgrade, Dunja. Well, Edita and Dunja became friends, supporting each other far from home in foreign countries at a boarding school, which they'd never even heard of before, never mind the fact that their two countries were at war. A couple of weeks after she arrived, I heard that Edita was not happy with her host family, and would I consider taking over that responsibility? Well, I wasn't too eager about that. I'd raised 3 teenagers on my own. I thought I deserved my freedom. And besides, my job at the American Friends Service Committee required constant travel. I traveled all over the country. And that was a heavy responsibility financially. Hosting a teenager, a foreigner, a war survivor, that just wasn't my cup of tea. But I was curious to meet Edita. And curiosity won out. On the day that I met Edita, and I also met Dunja, and took them both to a welcoming tea at Haverford College. And before the day was out, I had agreed to become Edita's host mother. You might say I fell in love. At my meeting, Central Philadelphia monthly meeting at the time, agreed to sponsor another young teenager, Eldar, a Bosnian Muslim who had crawled through the tunnel underneath the Sarajevo airport to escape from the city. By the fall of 1995, we had brought over about 40 Bosnian Muslim teenagers and to study in the Philadelphia area, and more were on their way. It was really the height of the Bosnian War, 1995. Dunja, as a Serb, was not part of the Community of Bosnia Foundation, and she had relatives that lived in Chicago, so she didn't have a host family. And so she spent almost every weekend at my house with Edita. She said Westtown was too boring. And Eldar, the boy from Sarajevo, lived right around the corner from my house. He was tall, good-looking, 18-year-old, with a swagger only teenage boys can get away with. So he was often there at my house. The girls were quite interested. And I fell in love with all these kids, these bright, attractive, interesting, and a community that I just never knew about, a world I didn't know about. But I was at least partially aware of the risk that I'd undertaken. I'd made a 3-year commitment to host a war survivor. The horrifying images of the war I had seen on TV were now going to be brought up close and personal. Those kids had left their families and friends behind in a brutal war. They'd lived through untold experiences that filled me with dread. Painful discoveries waited on that door that I had opened, but I was fascinated, and I wanted to know more. Eldar's English competency was our first big challenge. He wasn't able to keep up his studies at Friends Select, where he had had a 1-year scholarship. They didn't think he would be able to graduate. He started to lose his confidence and his swagger. And when the peace accords ending the war in Bosnia were signed in December of 1995, Eldar said he wanted to go home. He said he should never have come to America. Never have come? The more I got to know these kids, the more complicated everything seemed to become. What would he go home to? Sarajevo was a ruined city. How could he survive? What would happen to him? I started questioning whether we were doing the right thing bringing these kids over to the United States. I already had started questioning many of my long-held assumptions, pushed to reconsider and examine them by Dunya's pointed questions. Dunya was a very frank young woman. And she asked if I really thought our newspapers were independent. She pointed out that Time magazine and Newsweek and the New York Times all pretty much said the same thing. And I was also aware that she, as the only Serb student in a big group of Bosnians, I was painfully aware of our news reporting about the war, all demonizing the Serbs. Dunya understood the war as a civil war, like when our southern states seceded from the Union. It seemed to me that I wasn't hearing the whole story, and I began questioning my assumptions about communism and socialism as well. The Bosnian kids laughed at America's fear of communism, and Dunya was outspoken in her criticism of the high prices for theater and music. She said in Serbia the arts were supported by the government. Is this because of capitalism, she asked, that music and theater are so expensive? These questions just turned me upside down. I was filled with questions, and then came a new and unexpected challenge. One evening in the spring of 1996, soon after Eldar had left to go back to Sarajevo, Edita and I were washing the dishes, and she asked me if I would help her older brother, Sead, get a scholarship to come to America. At first I was skeptical, thinking about Eldar and his unhappy experiences. But Edita I found very difficult to say no to. She was very quiet, vulnerable, shy, and behind that mask was a young woman with awesome determination. So I gave in, and I began writing to Sead and occasionally talking to him on the phone. I learned he had dropped out of university when the war started because both his parents had lost their jobs and he was going to help support the family. Since he spoke English, he got a job as a translator at an international aid organization in Tuzla and soon became a project manager. His group had been among the first to meet the women and children and old people who were fleeing from Srebrenica in the mountains south of Tuzla. I asked him if those experiences had made him want to fight in the war. His answer was unequivocal. I could never kill somebody. Never. A woman or child? What do you think? The more I learned about Sead, the more he reminded me of the conscientious objectors who'd worked in France and other parts of Europe during the First and Second World Wars. As a child brought up at the end of the Second World War, I'd heard all kinds of stories about COs, and they were my heroes. I began to think Sead was a hero too. And once I decided to help him, doors began to open. Through a colleague at AFSC, I found a contact at a university in the Midwest that offered scholarships to Bosnian kids. And through another contact, I found a Quaker meeting in the same town, and Paul Davis, a member of that meeting, agreed to be both Sead's sponsor and that he and his wife would also be Sead's host family. Everything seemed to be going so easily. I thought these people were just waiting for me to ask them to help. And then I got a phone call. A member of the small meeting reported that Paul Davis had had a massive stroke. He was not expected to live. The meeting was overcome with his tragedy and with caring for Paul and his wife, and they were sorry, but they would not be able to help with Sead. I remember my shock. I blamed myself for letting Paul Davis carry so much of the burden of the paperwork and the transcripts and the applications. He was in his 80s. What if he died? What if he was already dead? What would I tell Sead? What would happen to his scholarship? What would happen to him if he stayed in Bosnia? What would I say to Edita? And then I remembered an elder in our meeting saying, when one door closes, another door opens. And my anxious thoughts slowed down. I decided to do nothing. The next day I got a call from John Selker, who was a member of Paul's meeting. He said he and his wife had been talking about the news about Paul, and that they had agreed that they would like to sponsor Sead. Then, a few weeks later, I got another call from John, and he said that he'd found a retired minister who with his wife, had agreed to sponsor, to be Sead's host family. My meeting, which was just about to disband from the Bosnian student project, which we had formed to help Eldar, who was part of our meeting, we were just about to set aside the money that we had raised to help him through school, and we decided to set that aside and use it to pay for Sead's transportation to the United States. Everything seemed to be happening. Everything was like a miracle to me. And this is how I remember that time. By the end of May, everything was back on track, and I was almost frightened by the energy that I felt. After the initial shock of Paul's stroke, every new turn of good fortune seemed like a miracle. Paul was going home, doing better than anyone had expected. Susan Schwartz in the admissions office seemed eager as I was to bring Sead over. She helped with incomplete transcripts, records lost during the war, and she advised about the college application. Sead went to Zagreb to take the TOEFL, the test for English as a foreign language. Who wouldn't be excited? Everywhere I looked, the doors were opening. And when we got the news that Sead had been accepted with a 2-year scholarship, I was convinced I was plugged into some amazing circuitry, some powerful connection to the universe. It felt wonderful. Now, many people ask me how I can remember all this, the conversations, the words, all the history. And I say to them that memory is difficult, especially when you're dealing with a war, with historical events, with trauma, with conflict, and with so much emotion. Luckily, I kept journals through all those years, and I wrote constantly to friends and family, so I had a lot of resources to sort of jog my memory and recreate events. I started writing about my experiences as soon as I got back to Pendle Hill, and I worked on it for years. I also know that memories don't leave you, especially painful memories, as we heard in a riveting testimony a few months ago. Memories kept pushing me to write. What was I trying to say? What was the truth? What was my story really about? I guess you can tell that part of my story was about the kids from Yugoslavia that I met. They were my guides and inspiration. They stirred my conscience, and they started me on my journey. And their voices still echo in my head. But to continue with the story. When the war in Bosnia ended in 1996, that summer, Edita and Dunja decided that they would go home for the summer and see their families again. And when they returned in the fall, they were sitting at my kitchen table talking about their summer and looking forward to the next summer already. Dunja said she cried when she learned that she'd won a scholarship to Chestnut Hill College. I was shocked and a little resentful. We'd worked so hard to get these kids out of harm's way. What was so compelling about their country? Why weren't they more grateful? I didn't say that. I just asked them what it was about their country that they missed so much. And they started to tell me, all words just tumbling out of them. And then Edita said that her mom wanted to meet me, and would I come to Tuzla the next summer? And Dunja said, and my mom wants to meet you too, and will you like to come to Belgrade? And I was a little breathless by that. And so later that night, I want to just read how I felt about this. Later that night, while I was lying in bed thinking about the day, I had a flash of understanding. This is another door opening. When doors open like that, I have to walk through and see what's on the other side. The war in Bosnia had shaken my complacency, forced me to think about what I stood for. But the war was over. So what would be the point of going to Bosnia and Serbia? Leave my job? Just up and take off for a foreign country so recently at war? What would I do there? but a quiet voice urged me on. I dreamed unsettling dreams about the war, hiding from soldiers, being captured, and then led out to confront the enemy, only to find there was no enemy. Questions and mysteries about humanity, about war, about God, were all jumbled together with a deep sadness and longing that I found hard to express. In my less anxious moments, I thought I was on a religious journey, a quest for that feeling of connection with the mystery of the universe. At other times, my confidence evaporated. When Eldar left to return to Sarajevo, I felt we had failed him. The uncertainty about the Bosnian students' future dragged on my spirits. I worried about Edita, about her parents. There were so many questions I couldn't answer. What was I thinking of? I felt brash, embarrassed, and self-inflated. And as you know, in the Quaker tradition, if you have a deep concern, something that you really are having trouble with, or a leading, you ask the meeting for a Clearness committee. So that summer, while the girls were away, I'd already written to the committee asking for a Clearness. And now I had a new layer of complication with these two girls asking me to come and visit. So a Clearness committee was called, and we met over the course of several months. The committee offered a series of questions that I was to consider each time for the next meeting. And I kept one of these questions and answers because I was writing the answers on an airplane as I was coming back from California. So here is just one of the questions that they asked. The question was, what is it about the bridge at Mostar and the destruction that seems so compelling to you? And I said, the bridge is a symbol of what has happened in Bosnia. It is so sad to me and touches me in a way that I find hard to articulate. As I thought about it, I realized that the destruction of the bridge is a visual representation of how I feel about my family. I don't want to go into that, but the connections are very real to me and reinforced by my relationship with the Bosnian students. I have an awareness that is like a physical sensation of the fear, the sense of betrayal, the bewilderment, the great longing and sorrow that connects me to the events in Bosnia and to the bridge and to the people. The destruction of the bridge symbolizes the complexity and possibilities for misunderstanding and suspicion that exist between people or in a society or in a family. I think the destruction of the bridge is a symbol of what happens when negative forces break out, are uncontrolled, and become evil forces. I feel drawn to look and learn more about that negative power, that process of disintegration of order, because I hope I'll learn something that can help me to understand and absorb a disturbing aspect of human nature, and one that also relates to my own family history. This emotional pull is from a place in my psyche that has been in the shadows for a long time, and it needs attention. Now that's just one of the questions they asked. We went through this we went back and forth for several months, I would say 4 or 5 months. And at last we sort of reached Clearness. We decided that I would travel alone, I would accept the invitation from these two girls, I would go without an itinerary or an agenda, I would stay with whoever would host me, to listen and learn, and to be guided by the Spirit. It was what my Clearness Committee described in its report to Central Philadelphia meeting as a ministry of witness. So in June of 1997, 18 months after the Dayton Peace Accords were signed, and Edita had finished her junior year at Westtown, I set off for the former Yugoslavia. After months of prayer, conversations, debates, spiritual nourishment, I was finally launched, and it felt like I was flying. First, I visited Dunja's family in Belgrade, and let me just walk over here to this map. By the time I went to Serbia, Serbia and Montenegro were the only countries that were left in the former Yugoslavia, and they were known as the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, or FRY. The United States did not recognize that nationality, but they did, and other countries did. And it was just made up of Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, and Vojvodina. So that is now FRY, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. This is Bosnia-Herzegovina after the war. It was divided into two separate entities. It was one country, but there were two separate entities. One was Republika Srpska, the Bosnian Serbs, and one was the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. That was the Bosnian Muslims and the Bosnian Croats. So this is how the country was divided even after the war. First, I visited Dunja's family in Belgrade. There were aunts and uncles and cousins in this tightly knit family, and through Dunja's aunt Joja, I met the charge d'affaires to Serbia from the United States, Richard Miles and his wife Sharon, who, to my great surprise, turned out to be Quakers. They invited me to spend an afternoon with them, and Richard was an expert in Soviet history, so we talked a lot about Serbia and how important Kosovo was to the Serbs. Kosovo was their mythic homeland, where the Serbian Orthodox religion had started. And the Serbs know that area as Metohija, or called church lands. Sharon Miles talked about her work at the International Office of Migration in Belgrade. And she explained how families of mixed ethnicity, that is a Bosnian Serb and a Bosnian Muslim, or a Bosnian Croat and a Bosnian Muslim, were at the highest risk even after the war, because they were not welcome anywhere. And so her Office of Migration was prioritizing the families of mixed ethnicity, whose futures were the most insecure after the war. I visited Edita's family in Tuzla, Bosnia. Let me just point out Tuzla to you. So this is Tuzla. This is Sarajevo. This is Mostar. Up here is a little place called Jajce that I visited. These were the main places that I visited in Bosnia. So I visited Edita's family in Tuzla and was treated as an honored guest. While I was there, a friend of Edita's family stopped by unexpectedly. Manda Petkovic was a Bosnian Croat. Her husband Dusan was a Bosnian Serb, and they had been best friends with Edita's family before the war. In fact, Manda was Edita's godmother. But when the war broke out, the neighbors had threatened and harassed them, to the point where one night the family had fled, taking with them their young son Boris, who was 15 at the time, and just a few possessions. The family was still living in Serbia now, 4 years later, and Manda had come to tell Edita's parents that she was applying for refugee status in Belgrade because they couldn't get back to their house. Their house was being lived in by Bosnian Muslims who themselves had been displaced by war. And even though the peace treaty had guaranteed the right of return, since this was a family of mixed ethnicity and there were Bosnian Muslims living in the house, the officials in the city would not go to bat for them. So they were going to apply for, they had already applied for refugee status, and Manda was coming to say goodbye to Edita's family. Luckily Manda and I spoke German because my Serbo-Croatian was almost non-existent, and nobody in that family except Edita spoke English. But I got to know Manda because she spoke German. And I told her that I knew Sharon Miles, who was working in the Office of International Migration in Belgrade. And Manda was so excited. I said, maybe she'll be able to help you. And Manda just grabbed hold of my hands and she said, you have to come and visit us. And she gave me the telephone number of Boris's, where her son Boris worked. He was a waiter in the Shark Café in Novi Sad. And so I took the phone number and thought about it a lot, but I was traveling all through Bosnia at the time for 3 months, I went from Tuzla to Sarajevo, where I stayed with a Quaker woman who had lived in Sarajevo throughout the whole siege. I went to Mostar to pay my respects to the remains of that beautiful old bridge. I stayed there with 2 elderly Bosnian women, sisters. They didn't speak a word of English, but they thought it was so wonderful. Every word I tried to say in Bosnian, and they would just clap and smile, and I'd try harder. I was passed from family to family like links in a human necklace. And everywhere I went, I saw destruction, despair, and the terrible legacy of war. Because the legacy of war is that there is a total breakdown of civil society. And that's what I learned. I heard many theories about why the war started, but I have to say that I ended up after 3 months with more questions than answers. I felt at times like a war tourist, and that being a witness was something like being a voyeur. And then I remembered Manda Pekovic, and I still had Boris's phone number. So I went back to Belgrade and stayed with one of Yoya's aunts and called the Shark Café. And lo and behold, Boris came to the phone. He said, "Oh yes, Miss Lyn." He knew who I was immediately, and his English was really good. He said, "Come, my mother's waiting for you." So Dunya's aunt, Yoya, and her uncle Dragan, and her mother, Nada, who you know, John, who was here at Pendle Hill, and Tom, and Sally, they all drove up with me. They offered to give me, this was my first car ride since I arrived in Yugoslavia. Everything else was bus. And so I really was happy to be in a car. So I said to Boris, "How will I recognize you?" And he said, "Well, meet me in the cathedral in the main square in Novi Sad. People say I'm tall and thin, and I'll be wearing a black shirt and black trousers." So we got to Novi Sad, and there was this young man standing there. And I have to say that gaunt would be a better description. He would have been a very good-looking young man, but his face was too thin, his cheekbones were too prominent, and there were these dark circles under his eyes. I tried not to show how disturbed I was by his look. So all of us bundled into the car, and he showed us how to get across across the river from Novi Sad to the little village of Sremska Kamenica, which is where the Pekovic family lived. And this is probably, for me, the sort of turning point in the story, the visit to the Pekovic family. All of us got into the apartment. Manda came running out. She was so excited to see me. And we had brought some food and supplies with us, and we sort of crowded into this tiny little apartment. And they were, speaking Serbo-Croatian, and Yoya was asking Amanda about what had happened to the family. And so, encouraged by Yoya's questions, Manda began her story. Often close to tears, she would catch herself, laugh nervously to recover her poise, and go on. Dusan added his part here and there, but Manda's intensity was the dominant energy in the room. Boris listened without comment. His attention never wavered from his mother as he followed the story. Yoya, Dragan, and Nada sat like statues, their faces frozen. I already knew some part of the story, so I didn't have to interrupt. And Manda ended by saying that they had applied for refugee status in Belgrade, and they'd been waiting for more than 2 months to hear whether they would be asked in for a second interview. Everyone sat for a few moments in silence. And then Yoya, her eyes bright with tears, offered to call the International Office of Migration when she got back to Belgrade, and that she took the number for the Shark Café and promised to call Boris the following morning. So I stayed overnight with the family and rode into Novi Sad with Boris the next morning and hung out at the Shark Café, or sort of tried not to be too obvious, while he was working. And when he wasn't working, he would sit down and tell me a little bit about how it had been for him to leave his city and his friends at the age of 15 and set off for this new country. He said he got through high school, he made a few friends after a year or two, and then he wanted to go to university, and he passed the entrance exams, but his transcripts were lost in the war. And he was an undocumented worker. They were there really illegally, now that the countries had divided. And so university was kind of out of the question. And he said when he realized that he was never going to be able to go back to school, he said, I pretty much gave up. You lose interest. He looked at me, his eyes steady and unapologetic. And around noon that day, we got a call from Yoya, the call that we were expecting. And first she talked to Boris, and he handed the phone to me without any comment. And Yoya repeated her message in English. I have bad news. The family has been turned down for refugee status, and she didn't know the details. Well, you can imagine how we felt about that. Manda had just come in when that conversation was happening. And I said to Yoya, well, what can I do? And she said, well, call Sharon Miles. So I called Sharon Miles, and by some fate, she answered the phone. And she said, yes, they can appeal this decision. I'll help them go through the paperwork. Let's make an appointment right now. So I put Boris on the phone, and they set up an appointment. But the family was just devastated. They'd been in this country now for 4 years. Boris went every day to work, never knowing if he would be picked up. He was an undocumented worker without papers. They could take you off the bus, take you out of a cab, come in a cafe and pick you up. And if you didn't have the papers, they conscripted you into the army. So there was Boris. The doors had slammed in his face. That's how I felt about him. And he was just hanging on, treading water. And I thought about Edita and how she was in a boarding school in Philadelphia, and her brother was at university. These were friends of Boris's. By some fate, look at the difference in their lives. It really, really upset me. And that night, Manda and I had spent the afternoon working in her garden. She had a big garden, and said they ate pretty well during the summer when they could raise a lot of their food. So we had a big salad and some bread, and Dusan and Manda and I sat around trying to make conversation, which was very difficult. We used Serbo-Croatian and English and German. And finally I said, it was slow going, I said, and we were tired and we were discouraged. I mean, you can imagine how this family felt. And I finally said, well, we speak a very strange language, don't we? And they started to laugh, and then we just laughed. We just roared. We were almost hysterical. And I think it was just the release of this terrible stress that we all were feeling. On the last morning that I was there, Manda wouldn't let go of me, clutching me like a drowning person. You must bring us luck, Lyn, she said. I said I was sure that Sharon Miles would help, and that I would call them when I got back to the United States to see how the appointment went. And before leaving, I took pictures of the family. All 3 of them were way too thin, all with tired smiles and an unhealthy color, but it was Boris who really broke my heart. A bright young man with his life still to be lived, so much potential thwarted by a war he had nothing to do with. Boris and I rode the bus back into Novi Sad that morning. I was on my way going home by then. He said, you've disrupted our lives, but in a good way. And I said, how is that? He looked away. After so many years of frustration, it's hard to keep a positive outlook. But then you came, and I believe you can help us. His words were like an anointing. After months of wandering through the war zones of Bosnia and Croatia, feeling helpless and overwhelmed by the tragedy everywhere, I had come upon a family in trouble. And through a series of seemingly random events, I was in a position to help them. Just think, on that one day when they heard that news, I was there. This was what Jung would call synchronistic. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reconnection to that mysterious energy I couldn't explain. It was the same excitement I'd had when doors began opening for Sayad to come to America. Once again, I was on a path, and I was determined to follow it, even though I had no idea where it would lead. So when I got back to the United States, I couldn't readjust. It felt like I'd gotten off the train at the wrong station. Everything was too big, too rich, too busy, too much. And going back to work at the American Friends Service Committee felt to me like going into a dark closet where I couldn't breathe. When someone asked me how my trip went, I said my heart broke, and I started to cry. It wasn't just that it was broken. There were bruises on my wrists where Manda had hung on to me, her life raft in a sea of trouble. Voices of the people that I met washed around constantly in my head. I could always hear them, although not their exact words. Someone in my Clearness committee told me I was experiencing culture shock and that I'd get over it. But I wasn't sure I wanted to get over it. My life had changed. I was a different person now, and there was no turning back. But I couldn't see the way forward either. The clerk of my Clearness committee said she didn't think my journey was over, and suggested that our Clearness committee become an oversight committee, which meant that they kept the support that I really needed at that time. About a month after I got back, I had such a powerful dream that it startled me awake, and I sat up in bed, hearing a voice saying, "These are the people you pray for. You're behind enemy lines, and war has broken out. Call your boss and tell him I've got to go back to Tuzla." I scribbled down the words on a piece of paper and fell back to sleep. And when I woke up the next morning, there was the message, barely legible, on my bedside table. I told my oversight committee about the dream, and they assured me I was being led, and that if I were patient, way would open, and they were right. 6 months later, no, maybe 9 months later, I was on my way to Belgrade. And that's where the story of the year in Belgrade begins. It was a very wonderful time at first. I met these wonderful students, these activists. I learned about Gene Sharp and his active nonviolence strategies. Most of these kids, both in Pristina and in Belgrade, used the strategies of Gene Sharp in their activities. John knows about this part of that story. I'd never heard of Gene Sharp. I knew nothing about this nonviolent social action, but they knew everything about it. When they heard me speak Serbo-Croatian, they said I spoke Serbo-Croatian like Tarzan spoke English. I just loved these kids. They were bright, they were funny, they were mischievous, they thwarted the police at every turn, and they had a few very big victories, which I'm not going to go into at this time, but if you must read the book. And I had a lot of hope that the ground war in Kosovo could be possibly averted. There was OSCE had brought in observers into Kosovo. There were concessions made by Milosevic. I had great hopes that really, in the end, maybe this could be averted. But the two, NATO and Milosevic, were like two trains running down the track that were going to bump into each other, and they did. And then the NATO bombs started to fall. And I'm going to stop right there. If you want to find out what happened to Boris and his family, if you want to find out what happened to Dunja when the bombs started falling on Belgrade, to the young activists that I knew, many of whom were lost and tangled in the war like leaves scattered before a hurricane, you'll have to read the book. And I leave it to you to decide whether I was liberated or unhinged, maybe both. But before opening up our discussion tonight, I was like to mention another little book that I wrote while I was at Pendle Hill. While I was here, Margaret Bacon, who some of you know, suggested that I might find it helpful to look at other Quaker women who lived and worked in war-torn regions. So I began poking around the Friends Historical Library at Swarthmore College, and I came across the journals of Rebecca Janney Timbers Clark. I was immediately hooked. Rebecca Janney was born in 1896, the daughter of a prominent Quaker family in Baltimore. If you know that part of the world, you know that Janney was a very well-known Quaker name. She was a senior at Columbia Teachers College when she felt a call from God. As she said, she was turned in the hand of God. And as soon as she graduated from Columbia, she began to study nursing. And to the dismay of her friends and family, and with the suggestion and support of the American Friends Service Committee, she set off for war-ravaged Poland in 1921 at the end of the First World War to nurse typhus victims. There was a pandemic of typhus in Eastern Europe at the end of the First World War, which we probably didn't hear much about. We heard about the smallpox and also the flu, which killed almost as many people as the war did. But we didn't hear about the typhus. She spent the rest of her life in service, first in Poland, where she met and married her husband, who was from Haverford College, and then in Russia, and then around the world. I thought I understood Rebecca, and that she would have understood me. She lived in that creative tension that stretches a person, pulled between a vision of utopia and the difficult everyday, between earnest devotion and joyful abandon, between the lure of adventure and the longing for a normal life. When she was 93, she was living at Medford Leys at the time, she was asked what had sustained her over the years, and she answered, "There's just one thing that has been of help to me in all my working life. That is, if a thing was puzzling, to quiet down and recognize that there was an answer being given to me if I would just be patient." Rebecca became a spiritual guide, leading me out of the wilderness of my anger and confusion. And that's the Pendle Hill pamphlet I wrote, Rebecca Janney Timbers Clark, Turned in the Hand of God. Books are available for your consideration, and that is really the end of the talk, and I just open it up now for your questions, remarks, comments, whatever. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those of you who aren't familiar with our process, if you'll raise your hand, I'll come by with the microphone because we want our folks who are watching live stream or on being recorded for future viewing to be able to hear your questions as well as Lyn's responses. And if you'll hold the microphone right below your lower lip, you'll be just fine. It's when you start gesticulating that it gets problematic. So, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Do you have an answer to the question of liberated or unhinged?
No.
That was a short answer, so I just thought I'd get the ball rolling.
Did you have any troubles with the officials at that time? Did you need a visa to get in?
Yes.
Did they give you 90 days for that visa or
Oh, what
longer?
a good question. You must have traveled there. Did
No,
you?
Not there.
No.
But traveled a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I first went, yes, you needed a visa. And you needed a letter of invitation from a Serb or you didn't need a visa for Bosnia, but you needed one for Serbia. So Dunya's aunt wrote me a letter of invitation. And I got what was a real coup. I got a visa that allowed me to go in and out of the country for 6 months, which was unheard of. The Balkan peace teams, that was the only thing I'd ever done that impressed them. I had a visa for 6 months, and I had multiple entry. What was the other part? Oh, yeah, 6 months. Yeah. Yes, it was really difficult, and the more I went in and out of the country, the more difficult it became, because I had to hunt up another person to write me a letter of invitation and go to another consulate, and it was difficult. Yeah. Good question.
So that partially gave you the ability to bridge as well,
Yes.
as you're going back
Yes.
and forth.
And the Balkan peace teams, I should say a little bit about the Balkan peace teams. It was a consortium of about 7 international peace groups. None of them were from the United States. It was Germany, Austria, Switzerland, France, the Netherlands, England, yeah. And I'm still trying to think of the person that you would know. And that Balkan peace teams had a team in Belgrade, and we went back and forth from Belgrade to Pristina, trying to make connections between the young people, trying to keep the conversation going, trying to support the activities that they were already doing. We had no agenda ourselves. That's one of the things I liked about the Balkan peace teams. We were supporting local people. And that they had also a team in Zagreb, Croatia, and in Split, Croatia. So there was nobody in Bosnia. One of the things I learned about Bosnia when I was there was that was really a focus for so many international organizations, aid and conflict resolution and rebuilding. I mean, it was just a beehive. And I felt while I was there that I would do more good, I would be more helpful, I would make more of a difference in Serbia and Kosovo than in Belgrade. There was a lot of work going on already. Yeah.
What did you learn from the kids about our educational system compared to theirs? That's number one. Number two.
Shall I take notes?
No, number two, this is it. Number two, the book ends many years ago. Are you still in touch with the kids? And can you tell us anything about that?
Okay. What was the first one? Oh, yes. Oh, that was really interesting. Because when Edita and Dunya arrived at Westtown, and when all the kids arrived, I had this sort of built-in assumption that our educational system was the best. And, you know, those poor socialists, those poor guys. And Edita was in advanced placement in her sophomore year at Westtown in both physics and mathematics, I think. The only thing that she was really struggled with was history, because obviously, and she was not fluent in English when she arrived. She could get by, she could understand. Dunya was fluent in English. Dunya was much more direct, and she had a lot of criticism about the United States. She criticized our music programs at Westtown. She said they were just awful. She was a very accomplished pianist, and she thought the music program at Westtown was inferior. The kids, all of them were surprisingly, to me, well prepared academically. And I met a couple of the teachers while I was in Bosnia who told me about the sort of attitude. It was a lot of rote learning. And Edita had said to me that the teachers are up here and the students are down here. And that, you do what the teacher tells you to do. But they did learn they were very well prepared, yeah. And your second question I do remember, and that was, am I still in touch with these kids? And I have to tell you, some of you know Edita. I don't think anybody here but Tom knows Boris. And I'm in touch with all of them. I got a note from Boris at Thanksgiving saying that he'd read the book, that he liked it very much, and that he thanked me for the help that I'd given them, which of course made me feel wonderful. I heard from Nada today. She'd seen the Pendle Hill email and said that she had read the book, and she said she couldn't put it down. And I really appreciated that, because I knew what she had been through. So the Edita is coming to visit me on the 17th of December with her new husband. They're living in Spain. Her brother is now a citizen of the United States, living in Oregon. Dunya and her is back in Belgrade. All the Serb kids that I knew went back to Belgrade. Very few of the Bosnian kids went back to Bosnia. Eldar, I lost touch with. Eldar had a very bad experience in the United States for all kinds of reasons, part of which I think was trauma. He had lived in Sarajevo for 3 years in that siege. His father was a general in the Bosnian army. You can imagine. I mean, he felt like he was sort of infantilized here. He wasn't independent. He felt, sort of suffocated here. And when Edith and I went to Sarajevo, we tried to get in touch with him, but he didn't want to visit us. He said his English was too bad, but he didn't want to visit us, which I do understand. So I think that's most of the people that I talked about in the book. Yeah. Yes, we really got along well. we had a wonderful relationship with I did with all those kids. Yeah, made a big difference. Yeah.
Did you learn the meanings of their names? Like Nada means hope.
Hope. Yeah.
And a few others you've mentioned, but.
Edita told me, her Edita told me that her name is not a Bosnian name, and she said that her mother did not want to name her a name that was recognizable as Bosnian, but she didn't tell me what it meant. Boris, no. The other, Joy, yeah. Sinishe, not Bor. I can't think of any others that I knew a meaning for. Did you know of some? Because I know you know Serbian. Yeah. No, I can't think either.
Sorry, that answer was I can't think now, so. Oh, well. Can you pass it to the end?
Hi, you're bringing back a ton of memories for me because I was in Yugoslavia before the war. I think I was there for a little over a week, and it was the same week that Nixon resigned.
Oh.
So I'm more, I suppose, the age of these people's parents, but I was very young when I was there.
Yeah.
I was traveling with my uncle who was working for the State Department in Athens, and we were traveling in, at the time, what was an American sedan, or it was anyway, it was an American car where you could sit 3 comfortably side by side, and as we were traveling through Yugoslavia, jaws would drop and fingers would point, and I was there like, well, what is it, And I later learned when I got unused to that size car and saw one in London when I was getting used to all the smaller size cars. So, and they even stole the insignia off the car. But I do have several questions. I could go on and on about my experiences now, and thank you for that. But one of the first things I saw when we entered Yugoslavia was, and we entered it from the south. Albania at the time was a closed country. Mm-hmm. We could look up into the hills, and there were a couple of people harvesting wheat by scythes. Mm-hmm. There were no electric wires. There were very few roads. But unfortunately, as we traveled through Yugoslavia, there were smokestacks in a lot of the cities and towns, and just pollution going like crazy. There were no trash cans, so trash would build up. But the women in the southern part of Yugoslavia wore these wonderful pants that were sort of like handkerchiefs that were tied on the outside of your leg. And I understand that they may have been Muslim women.
Yeah, they were Muslim.
And I always, when I heard about the war, I worried about them. The other thing that I wonder about is when we were in Dubrovnik, at the time it was a city that was a walled city, and it was a beautiful walled city that was not destroyed.
Oh, it was bombarded
And
very
it was,
heavily.
Marble, big blocks of marble, white, orangey marble. And my uncle, who had seen the pyramids, did not want to stay more than an hour. So my cousin and I tried to run around the whole time, but we got halfway, through our time period, and we realized we had to return the same way, then go on. And he said, "Oh, don't worry. You'll see Split. You'll see other walled cities. It'll, and I always worry, well, is it still there? And Split was nothing, compared to Dubrovnik.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I could go on. But my two questions are about the women who wore those pants and the walled city of Dubrovnik and what's happened, because I was there before the war.
Well, but Dubrovnik was bombarded by the Serb army early in the war. And I went there in 1997. And when I was walking through the city, I said it was like walking through a museum that had been deserted. There was nobody there, just stray cats. But a lot of the buildings had been restored by 1997 even. And now I went back again in 2010, and it's you can't tell, except maybe the tiles on the roof are a slightly different color. Did you have something to say?
I was going to say much that same thing. You could tell. We were there in April of this year, and from up on the mountains from which they were shelled, you can tell which buildings were hit by the color of the tiles. It becomes quite a checkerboard when you look down at the city. But the emptiness is there in a way because fewer people live within the walled city now than did before the war. But they're replaced by thousands of tourists getting off cruise boats that make it almost impossible to see the walls or anything else.
Yeah. Sad. Yeah.
Lyn, I'm really interested in your Clearness committee that became an oversight committee, and you told us they helped you with questions for discernment. Are there other ways that they supported you in following your leading and accompanied you while you were away?
Well, one of the things that they did was that we decided that every morning we would have a 15 minutes of meditation, and that all of us in that committee would have the meditation at the same time, no matter where we were. And we did that for the whole time. It was a wonderful feeling that even when you were in Serbia and Kosovo and wherever you were, somebody was there connecting with you. It was really wonderful. When you say other ways, my mind goes blank. I mean, we met probably once or twice a month in the meeting house. We got to be very close, of course. And I remember one time the committee put their hands on my head as I was leaving and prayed for me. And I felt very self-conscious about this. But I loved it. It was a wonderful feeling, yeah. Did you have any thoughts about that?
Did they also help with practical ways, raising funds or anything
gosh,
like
yes.
that?
Oh, yes. When people heard that I was going to Yugoslavia, I was flooded with contacts and suggestions and what to wear and what to eat and what not to eat and all kinds of things. And they helped me with that. And that's one of the reasons I kept a list. We made up a list of all the contacts that had been suggested. And I took it with me. But that's why we decided that I would travel without an itinerary, and that I would stay with whoever asked me. I didn't want to. I wanted way to open. I wanted it to be a leading, and not like that. They also supported me financially. And when I went to when I quit my job and went to Serbia and Kosovo, they raised money for me. They said which would be for an R&R, or if I needed to get out quickly. And while I didn't use some of all of that money, I did at Christmas time. I'd been there for 7 months. I went to Thich Nhat Hanh's Buddhist village in France for I think 10 days, and that money was what I used to go. So they were just a wonderful group of people, and they kept with me. That was the amazing thing to me, all through that time, probably 3 or 4 years. Always support. I wrote to them all the time, and they kept all the letters. It was just wonderful. It was really wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments for Lyn? In that case, let us thank you very much again for your sharing this evening. We'll let you escape from the podium and the entanglement of the microphone, and let you have some refreshment and answer questions at the table as you sign books and sell them if you wish. Thank you very much.